Odds are, this is not your first history course. You've all been acquainted with history since grade school, but probably never thought too much about the question, what is history? If I were to ask you that question, I know I'd get some great answers, all probably touching on something about it being the study of the past. History is, yes, about the past, but there is more to the discipline of history than that. First, let's look at the word itself. Like with a lot of our language, we have to look back to the ancient Greeks because the root of the word history is the ancient Greek word historia. Historia can be translated as either inquiry or research, both which make sense when you think about it. After all, to study the past, one must start with a question or inquiry. What was life like in ancient Greece? Why did the Roman Empire fall? Why are the Texas Rangers a cursed baseball team? And to answer these questions, you must conduct research. Now, I told you the root of the word history, but we have yet to arrive at an actual definition for the word. I think for our purposes, it is sufficient to say it is simply an account of the origin and development of humankind. History is, at its heart, a human story, which I think is why I find the discipline so fascinating. Humans are never dull, and often there's a lot more to them if you scratch below the surface. That works, I think, on the individual and collective level. Now, I mentioned that the word historia is an ancient Greek word, and that's no accident. As a matter of fact, it was the ancient Greeks who first began to conduct what we would call the formal discipline of history. The first person that we are aware of that did history in a manner familiar to us in the modern era was a Greek named Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who lived about 2,400 years ago. He was curious as to the origins of a recent conflict between Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. So what did he do? He traveled the Mediterranean world doing research to see what evidence he could uncover. And he did so with something of a skeptical eye. After all, as we will see later, you cannot always take your sources at face value. Before we talk about sources, however, I want to dig a bit deeper into what history is. For a lot of us, it has probably been a discipline full of names and dates. And while those are important elements to the past, names and dates do not provide a complete picture of the past. I like to say that history is not the study of what happened and when, but why things happened the way they did and the consequences. Let's go back to the root word historia, or inquiry. For history to be properly done, you must ask three questions. What happened? Why? How did things turn out, or what were the consequences? If you have these questions, then inevitably you must look somewhere for answers. That brings me to the question, how do we know what we know? For historians, there are two major kinds of sources we look at, primary and secondary. Primary sources are sources which originate from the person or time you are studying, and in many ways are a historian's best friend. Any major research project undertaken by a historian must include a heavy dose of primary source material, since that allows us all to peer more closely into the past and understand how residents of the past interpreted their world. What are some examples of primary sources? Written documents such as letters, journals, newspapers, or government documents are the first examples that come to mind. Of course, many of you produce written primary sources daily in the form of tweets or Instagram posts. Can you imagine being a 22nd century historian combing through Twitter feeds and Instagram accounts? Not all primary sources are written, however. Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night and my favorite album, The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, are both examples of primary sources for historians studying the art or music of the past. For historians who study fashion in the material past, primary sources could be Victorian-era suits or dresses. The point is, pretty much any product of the past can be a primary source. Then you have secondary sources. Secondary sources are those works produced by historians and other kinds of authors, hopefully after a deep dive into primary sources. For example, a history of the Holocaust would be a secondary source. My recently published biography of newspaper publisher, oil man, and philanthropist Amon G. Carter, which I wrote after extensive research in the Texas Christian University archives, is a secondary source. In the next video, I want to talk to you all briefly about interpreting sources and the complexities of exploring the human past.